Damascus, December 2024. In a looted warehouse on the outskirts of the capital, investigators crack open a false wall. Behind it, shrink-wrapped bricks of white pills, stamped with crescent moons and double C's Captagon. Millions of doses, enough to flood an entire region. This isn't a cartel stash. This is a balance sheet. For over a decade, the Syrian state survived not by reform, trade, or oil, but by chemistry. While sanctions strangled the economy and oil fields slipped out of government hands, a new export quietly replaced them. Not wheat, not phosphates, amphetamines. This is the story of how a modern state turned into a narco-economy, and how Maher al-Assad, commander of Syria's most feared unit, became the enforcer of a shadow empire built on pills. The Syrian war didn't just destroy cities, it quietly erased the state's ability to earn money. By 2012, the Syrian government was bleeding revenue from every direction. Its eastern oil fields, once a critical source of income, were no longer under state control. They had fallen into the hands of Kurdish forces, backed by the United States. Tourism, which once brought in billions of dollars a year, vanished almost overnight as violence spread and borders closed. At the same time, international sanctions froze Syria's foreign currency reserves, cutting the regime off from global banking and trade. The result was simple and brutal. The state was broke, but the war didn't slow down. It became more expensive. Soldiers still expected salaries. Militias still needed weapons, fuel, and supplies. Loyal commanders and power brokers still needed to be rewarded to keep them loyal. Yet the traditional tools of state finance, oil exports, tourism revenue, access to banks were gone. What remained was control over territory, the ability to instill fear, and the logistics of moving goods across borders and checkpoints. That financial vacuum demanded a substitute economy, something portable, profitable, and invisible to sanctions, something that could operate outside banks, outside trade law, and outside diplomacy. Drugs fit perfectly. Captagon wasn't new. The amphetamine-based stimulant had circulated across the Middle East for decades, mostly as a recreational drug used for long nights, long drives, and long workdays. What changed wasn't the substance, it was the scale. Syria didn't simply traffic Captagon, it industrialized it. As the formal economy collapsed, Captagon offered something rare in a sanctioned state: reliability. The drug was cheap to produce, relying on precursor chemicals that were relatively easy to source or smuggle. Pill pressing required minimal infrastructure, no refineries, no pipelines, no ports. A small warehouse and a few machines were enough to begin production. Even more important was demand. Across the Gulf, Captagon consumption had already surged, creating a massive and lucrative market just across Syria's borders. The pills were small, lightweight, and easy to conceal, making them ideal for smuggling through checkpoints, ports, and shipping containers. A single kilo of Captagon pills could be worth more than a barrel of oil, and unlike oil, it didn't need pipelines, tankers, or international buyers. Captagon wasn't just a drug, it was portable sovereignty. If Syria was evolving into a narco state, its engine wasn't hidden in the shadows, it was institutional. And at the center of it sat the 4th Armored Division. This wasn't a normal military unit designed for frontline combat. The 4th Division functioned as the regime's Praetorian Guard, an elite force built not just to fight enemies, but to protect power itself. It was commanded by Major General Maher al-Assad, the brother of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, which placed it in a category no other unit could touch. The 4th Division controlled the arteries of the country, key highways, border crossings, ports, the checkpoints surrounding Damascus itself. In a country shattered by war, that control mattered more than territory on a map. Because in Syria, control of movement equals control of money. Nothing large moved fuel, food, weapons, or pills without passing through 4th Division hands. This is where the line between state and business dissolved. Captagon factories didn't hide from the 4th Division. They didn't need to. They operated because of it. Protection wasn't informal, it was structural. Routes were secured. Cargo was waved through checkpoints. Interference from rival militias or customs officials simply didn't happen. The 4th Division didn't need to manufacture drugs itself to dominate the trade. It only needed to control logistics. In wartime Syria, logistics were everything. Whoever controlled the roads controlled the economy. At that point, the drug trade wasn't corruption bleeding into the state. It was the state functioning exactly as designed, just with a new product. Captagon production in Syria didn't hide in caves or remote mountain valleys. It didn't need to. Instead, the laboratories moved closer to power. They appeared inside military-controlled zones, near active airbases, and on land seized from civilians who had been displaced by the war. These weren't accidental locations. They were chosen for protection. As the conflict dragged on, witness accounts and drug seizures began to reveal how openly the system operated. Pill-pressing machines were imported through regime-controlled ports. Precursor chemicals were transported in military trucks, the same vehicles used for troops and weapons. Production sites weren't guarded by private criminals or local gangs, but by uniformed soldiers standing watch. This wasn't a case of rogue officers looking the other way. It was coordination. Access to secure land, protected transport routes, and armed security meant production could scale without fear of interference. No police raids, no customs inspections, no rival groups muscling in. The same structures built for war were quietly repurposed for manufacturing narcotics. That's why this wasn't corruption on the margins of the state. It was vertical integration. The same military units that once crushed protests now protected pill presses. The same checkpoints that stopped civilians ensured chemicals arrived on time. Violence wasn't separate from the business model, it enforced it. In wartime Syria, force didn't just enable production. Force was the guarantee that production would continue. Once Captagon pills were pressed, they didn't move like contraband. They moved like an official export. Organized, repeatable, and routed through infrastructure normally reserved for legitimate trade. One major artery ran through the port of Latakia, feeding directly into Mediterranean shipping lanes. From there, containers blended into global commerce, indistinguishable from ordinary cargo. Another route ran south through Syria into Jordan and onward to the wealthy markets of the Gulf states. A third path moved through Lebanon, where maritime containers were routinely labeled as machinery, food, or fruit. These weren't improvised runs by desperate smugglers. They were logistics chains. Shipments crossed multiple borders, passed through ports, and entered international waters without disruption. That level of consistency required paperwork, timing, and protection at every step. Authorities eventually caught some of it. Massive seizures in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Italy, and Greece revealed shipments worth billions of dollars. Not millions, billions. Enough to rival Syria's remaining legal exports combined. At that scale, survival isn't luck. No independent smuggler survives repeated billion-dollar shipments without state cover, access to ports, borders, and immunity from interference. This wasn't smuggling. It was foreign policy by other means. In a world that had cut Syria off from diplomacy and trade, Captagon became leverage, crossing borders when ambassadors could not, generating influence where sanctions tried to impose silence. Maher al-Assad was never meant to be the public face of the regime. He didn't give speeches or shape narratives. He functioned as something far more durable, the regime's muscle memory. He was known for extreme brutality, for maintaining personal command over Syria's most elite units, and for an absolute, zero-tolerance approach to disloyalty. In a system built on fear, Maher wasn't an administrator. He was the guarantor that fear still worked. His role wasn't to design economic policy or manage spreadsheets. Others could handle accounting. His job was compliance, to ensure that when orders were given, they were followed, immediately and without negotiation. Factories functioned not because contracts were signed, but because refusal carried consequences. Routes stayed open because checkpoints belonged to his division. Profits flowed upward because nothing of value moved through Syria without 4th Division approval. Every shipment, every corridor, every protected road ultimately traced back to his authority. That's how the system held together, not through ideology and not through persuasion, but through certainty. Everyone involved understood the rules. Participation was rewarded. Resistance was erased. In narco states, ideology fades. What remains is control. Maher al-Assad wasn't the architect of the drug economy. But he was the reason it worked. When the state could no longer rely on money, legitimacy, or law, it relied on him. And under that logic, enforcement wasn't a function of the business. It was the foundation. By the late 2010s, Captagon was no longer a side operation or an emergency workaround. It had become central. By value, it emerged as Syria's top export, outpacing anything the sanctioned, war-ravaged economy could legally produce. Inside regime-held areas of Syria, something unusual began to happen. While the country remained internationally isolated and under crushing sanction, parts of the state stabilized financially. Salaries were paid, security services continued to operate. Loyalist power networks didn't just survive, they adapted. At the same time, loyalist elites accumulated wealth offshore, insulating themselves from the collapse at home. This wasn't random enrichment, it was the financial reward for maintaining the system. Captagon revenues filled the gap left by frozen reserves, lost oil fields, and vanished trade. The Captagon trade didn't replace the state, it became the state. Every pill moving across a border helped fund soldier salaries, keeping units loyal and deployed. It sustained intelligence networks that monitored dissent and suppressed opposition, and it reinforced patronage systems that rewarded cooperation and punished defection. In a war economy, that balance mattered more than legitimacy or growth. This wasn't criminal chaos spilling out of control. It was organized, deliberate, and structured. Captagon functioned as fiscal policy under siege, a way to convert territory, logistics, and coercion into revenue when every legal option had been cut off. Sanctions were designed to starve the regime of resources. Captagon ensured it never truly starved. What emerged wasn't a failed state overtaken by criminals. It was a state that redefined survival and funded it, one pill at a time. Every hidden economy depends on one thing above all else: control. And when regime control fractured, the secret economy didn't disappear, it surfaced. As front lines shifted and insiders fled, the structures that once kept everything sealed began to crack. Abandoned warehouses were discovered, still stacked with pills and chemical residue. Ledgers never meant to be seen were left behind, exposing quantities, routes, and payments. Entire laboratories stood empty, marked not by criminal graffiti, but by military insignia and equipment. What years of sanctions couldn't fully reveal, collapse did. Sanctions can freeze accounts and restrict trade, but they can't force doors open. They can't make people run. When authority retreats in a hurry, paperwork gets abandoned, guards vanish, and secrets lose their protection. That's when the illusion shattered. The evidence made one thing unavoidable: Syria wasn't merely tolerating Captagon production as a side effect of war. It was running on it. The drug economy wasn't hidden beneath the state, it was woven through it. Warehouses, labs, and logistics weren't improvisations, they were components of a system that had functioned openly within regime-controlled space. Collapse didn't create the truth, it exposed it. Once the vaults opened, the question was no longer whether the drug trade existed, but how long it had been sustaining everything else. What looked like survival under sanctions was, in reality, dependence. When the war loosened the grip of power, the evidence spoke clearly. Captagon wasn't a shadow economy. It was the engine, revealed only when the engine room was left unlocked. For years, countries surrounding Syria treated Captagon as a criminal nuisance, an unpleasant but manageable problem, something for police, customs officers, and anti-narcotics units to deal with quietly. Seizures were reported, traffickers were arrested, and life went on. Then the scale became impossible to ignore. This wasn't about addiction levels anymore. It wasn't even about public health. The volume, frequency, and organization of the shipments told a different story. This was industrial, systematic, strategic. What was moving across borders wasn't just drugs. It was money, influence, and leverage. Jordan was among the first to feel it. As Captagon flows intensified along its northern border, Jordan militarized its frontier. This wasn't standard anti-smuggling enforcement. Armed clashes followed. Drones were shot down. The border became a security theater, not a customs problem. In the Gulf, alarms spread quickly. States that had once viewed Captagon as a youth issue began pressuring Damascus diplomatically. The pills flooding their markets weren't random, they were coming from one place, along protected routes, in quantities that implied state involvement. Then Europe took notice. Massive seizures revealed that Syrian-made pills weren't stopping in the Middle East, they were reaching Mediterranean ports and landing on European shores. At that point, the problem was no longer regional, it was international. The drug wasn't destabilizing Syria anymore, it was destabilizing everyone else. What began as a survival economy inside a sanctioned state had evolved into something far larger, a transnational pressure weapon. Borders hardened, diplomatic language shifted, intelligence agencies recalibrated. Because once drugs move at the scale of exports and shape the behavior of states, they stop being a crime problem. They become a security problem. Captagon saved the Syrian regime, but poisoned its future. A state that funds itself through addiction can't reform. A military that profits from crime can't demobilize. A system built on secrecy collapses violently when exposed. Maher al-Assad didn't invent Captagon. He weaponized it. Today, the pills keep moving, but the cover is gone. What was once hidden behind sovereignty is now visible as infrastructure. Labs, routes, divisions, signatures. Syria didn't just survive sanction, it adapted by monetizing despair. And history offers a brutal rule. When a state runs on drugs, it eventually becomes one. Captagon didn't corrupt Syria from the outside. It grew from within, pressed into shape by war, sealed by sanctions, and enforced at gunpoint. The pills may dissolve, the damage won't.